Okay, let me call this hearing to order, and let me thank Senator Collins and her staff for helping to put on this hearing, and thank all of the subcommittee members who will be participating, and the panelists who will be with us virtually in a few minutes. There is an interesting debate among the people of this country about which powerful special interest has the most clout on Capitol Hill. Some people think it may be Wall Street, and some people may think it's the military-industrial complex, and some people think it's the fossil fuel industry. I myself may be wrong, but I would give the nod to the pharmaceutical industry, an industry which charges the American people by far the highest prices in the world for prescription drugs, and has managed to create a situation where they can raise their prices to any level they want any day of the week. So today, people are walking into a drugstore, walking into a pharmacy. Pharmacist is telling them, sorry, price of your medicine has substantially gone up. That's what the drug companies have done. Drug companies are an industry which year after year make huge profits, and they pay their CEOs incredibly large compensation packages. It is an industry which is significantly responsible for the fact that in the United States, we pay the highest prices in the world for health care, almost double what any other country pays. It is an industry which has an incredibly opaque pricing system, which pays one branch of government, which charges one branch of government a very different price than it charges another for the same drug. Same exact drug, Medicare will pay a price, Medicaid will pay a price, Veterans Administration will pay a price, community health centers will pay a different price, all for the same exact drug. And that's true for hospitals, for nursing homes, and for individuals. Very hard to know what they are charging anybody else. This is an industry that has paid $32 billion in fines for a variety of illegal actions over the last 20 years, including price fixing, overcharging the federal, state, and local governments for their products, bribery, collusion, fraud, and deception. And yet this is an industry which keeps going on its merry way, virtually untouchable year after year after year. Now, how did they get away with that? And it is not hard to understand. During the last 23 years, the drug companies have spent $7.6 billion on lobbyists, $7.6 billion over the last 23 years, including the former leadership of the Democratic and Republican parties. They have more than 1,500 lobbyists here in Washington. There are 435 members of the House and Senate. They have 1,500 lobbyists here in Washington, as well as lobbyists in virtually every state capital in this country. Since 1990, they have spent nearly $730 million on campaign contributions, which have gone to many, many hundreds of members of Congress in both political parties. Let's be clear, the pharmaceutical industry is not particularly sympathetic to the Democratic Party or the Republican Party. They try to buy both parties. In fact, I think it's fair to say that it is not Congress which regulates the drug companies, but the drug companies which regulate Congress. And that has got to change. Congress finally, after years and years and years of talk, finally has got to summon up the courage to take on the drug companies and lower prescription drug prices in America. That is what the American people want, and that is what we need to do. Last year, 1 out of 5 Americans cannot afford to buy the medicine prescribed by their doctor. How crazy is that? Walking into a doctor's office, getting a diagnosis, getting a prescription drug, but you can't afford to fill it. Meanwhile, while Americans are dying or getting sicker than they should because they cannot afford the medications they need, 9 large drug companies made over $58 billion in profits last year. $58 billion in profits, 9 companies, while just 6 pharmaceutical industry CEOs made $564 million in total compensation over the past 3 years. Not too shabby. Every day in my office, and I'm sure every congressional office, we hear stories from Americans unable to afford the prescription drugs they need. Today, we will hear from Ms. Elia Spates from Derby, Vermont, who will tell us how the outrageously high price of insulin in America has impacted her life. And of course, she is not alone. In 2018, 1 out of every 4 Americans with type 1 diabetes were forced to ration insulin because they could not afford it. You believe that? 1 out of 4 Americans with diabetes forced to ration insulin. Let's be clear, insulin is not a new drug. It was invented nearly 100 years ago by Canadian scientists who sold the patent rights for insulin for just $3 because they believed it should be accessible to everyone who needed it. And yet over the past decade, the price of insulin has gone up by over 300%. Yet, 50 miles from my home in Vermont, you can purchase insulin in Canada at about 1/10 the price that we pay in this country. And let's be clear, prescription drug prices in Canada are also high compared to other countries around the world. According to a recent study by RAND, a standard unit of insulin costs $98 in the United States, $12 in Canada, $11 in Germany, $9 in France, $7.52 in the UK, and $6.94 in Australia. And it's not just insulin. A 1-month prescription of Entocort to treat Crohn's disease costs $830 in the US, $81 in Canada. 1 asthma inhaler, Flovin Discet, costs $242 in the US, $27 in Canada. 2 EpiPens cost $686 in the United States, $278 in Canada, and on and on and on it goes. Same medications manufactured by the same companies in the same factories, all available in countries around the world at a far, far lower price than here in the United States. In my view, we can no longer tolerate a system that allows the former CEO of Gilead to become a billionaire by charging $1,000 for a hepatitis C drug called Sovaldi that costs just $1 to manufacture and can be purchased in India for $4. Can no longer tolerate a system that allows the chairman of Mylan, Robert Corey, to receive a $164 million compensation package in 2016 after his company jacked up the price of EpiPen by 550% over a 9-year period. All over this country, the American people are asking a simple question. How many people need to die? How many people need to get unnecessarily sicker before Congress is prepared to take on the greed of the pharmaceutical industry? The American people are demanding that Congress listen to their concerns and not cower before the power of the pharmaceutical companies. In order to begin to address this issue, I have introduced 3 bills with many of my colleagues in the Senate and the House that would substantially reduce prescription drug prices in this country and also save the federal government significant sums of money. The first bill is the Prescription Drug Price Relief Act, which would cut prescription drug prices in half by pegging the price of medicine in the United States to the median price in 5 major countries: Canada, the United Kingdom, France, Germany, and Japan. Second bill is the Medicare Drug Price Negotiation Act, which would direct the Secretary of Health and Human Services to negotiate lower prices for prescription drugs on the Medicare Part D. Every other major country on earth, in one form or another, negotiates drug prices, and the time is long overdue for Medicare to do that as well. According to a recent study, if this bill became law, the United States government could save more than $345 billion over the next decade. Third bill, the Affordable and Safe Prescription Drug Importation Act, would allow patients, pharmacists, and wholesalers to legally purchase safe, low-cost medicine from Canada and other major countries. We import all kinds of stuff, food, everything else. No reason why we cannot safely re-import prescription drugs. So with that, bottom line is, we've been talking about this issue for decades. It is time to act. Senator Collins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding our very first subcommittee hearing on an issue where I hope that Democrats and Republicans can find common ground, and that is improving the affordability of prescription drugs. When a doctor prescribes a needed medication, an insurmountable barrier to taking it should not be its cost. More than half of Americans, and an overwhelming majority of our seniors, take at least one prescription drug each month. For many, access to these medicines not only is critical to their well-being, but also can literally be a matter of life or death. During my recent tenure as chairman of the Senate Aging Committee, one of my top priorities was to uncover the reasons for spikes in pharmaceutical drug prices and to help make medicines more affordable for more Americans. I led a bipartisan investigation with then Senator Claire McCaskill of Missouri on sudden price spikes of off-patent drugs and the manipulation of the market by people like the infamous Martin Shkreli. I also worked with Senator Bob Casey to investigate various entities in the opaque market for pricing of prescription drugs, such as pharmacy benefit managers. Our committee also held hearings on the price of insulin and drugs to treat rheumatoid arthritis, listening closely to patients and other witnesses. The answers that the Aging Committee received from its inquiries, investigations, and hearings resulted in several bills being signed into law. For example, the Making Pharmaceutical Markets More Competitive Act provides a more transparent and open application process for generics. It expedites the timeline for FDA to review and approve applications. Since enactment of this law, not only are we seeing more applications, but approvals are up considerably, with 28 priority generics and 35 competitive generic therapies approved in fiscal year 2020 alone. The Patient Right to Know Drug Prices Act and the Know the Lowest Price Act banned pharmacy gag clauses. They prohibited pharmacists from telling their customers if their prescription would cost less if they actually paid for it out of pocket rather than using their insurance plans. This legislation also required the disclosure of settlements reached between Biologic and biosimilar developers to the Federal Trade Commission. This has been required of generic drug developers since 2003. At the end of 2019, Congress passed legislation that will improve and streamline the FDA approval process for new forms of insulin, which should usher in more competition into a category that has seen huge and unwarranted price increases. And at an Aging Committee hearing on the cost of insulin in 2018, a father from New Gloucester, Maine, testified that insulin for his 13-year-old son with type 1 had tripled in price, forcing him to purchase from Canada at a lower cost, very similar to what the chairman has described. The cost of insulin is among the most prominent examples, and I'm grateful that a constituent of the chairman is here today to share her own story. As co-chairs of the Senate Diabetes Caucus, which I founded in 1998, Senator Jeanne Shaheen and I introduced legislation in the last Congress to create a new pricing model for insulin, which, as the chairman pointed out, was first isolated a century ago in Canada, and yet has soared in price in recent years. Recently, we have seen some nascent steps on insulin affordability. More than 1,700 Part D and Medicare Advantage plans have agreed to cap monthly copays for insulin at $35 this year. Additionally, manufacturers are adding more affordable options, such as Eli Lilly's $35 copay program, which has been available during the pandemic. These are good first steps, but I hope we can do much more. Another focus area is biosimilar competition. Later this spring, along with my colleague, Senator Tim Kaine, I will reintroduce the Biologic Patent Transparency Act to prevent drug manufacturers from gaming the patent system. Time is money when it comes to abusing the patent system to thwart competition. There are reports that AbbVie, the manufacturer of Humira, filed 247 patent applications for this drug and won patents that could have protected the medicine for up to 39 years from any competition from a biosimilar. In fact, the price of Humira in the United States increased by an additional 6.2% in January of 2019 to offset price reductions from biosimilar competition overseas. Mr. Chairman, in the last Congress, 3 committees, the Health Committee, the Finance Committee, and the Judiciary Committee, all advanced bipartisan bills to reform our broken drug pricing system. I was a co-sponsor of the Grassley-Wyden bill in the last Congress, as were several members of this subcommittee. HHS Secretary Becerra and I spoke about drug prices at length during his nomination process. Let's bring this bill to the Senate floor as separate legislation so that we can have full and open debate and amendment to come up with the best solutions. We want new medicines to reach consumers and for pharmaceutical companies that invest in the research and take the risks necessary to develop these drugs to see a fair return on their investment. But we must do more to ensure that these essential medicines are more affordable and their prices transparent. I hope that today's hearing will help us craft policies to strike that balance. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Collins. We have an outstanding group of panelists, and let me begin by welcoming our first panelist, Dr. Aaron Kesselheim, who is a professor of medicine at Harvard Medical School and a faculty member in the Division of Pharmacoepidemiology and Pharmacoeconomics in the Department of Medicine at Brigham and Women's Hospital. Dr. Kesselheim created and leads the program on regulation, therapeutics, and law, an interdisciplinary research program focusing on prescription drugs and medical devices, patient health outcomes and regulatory practices, and the law. He has authored over 450 publications in peer-reviewed medical and health policy literature. Dr. Kesselheim, thanks very much for being with us.
Thank you, Chairman Sanders, Ranking Member Collins, and members of the committee. We're here today because the U.S. spends far more on drugs per capita than any other industrialized nation, over $1,200 in 2018, while the OECD average was less than $600. High U.S. prices are primarily driven by spending on brand name drugs, most of which have been on the market for many years, during which time they're subject to astonishing price increases. We compare drugs that accounted for the highest Medicare Part B spending with Japan, Germany, Switzerland, and the UK, and found prices 46 to 60% lower in those places. How is this possible? I want to focus on 3 reasons and their solutions. First, the US allows drug makers to set prices after FDA approval at any level they want, and then requires Medicare and Medicaid to pay no matter what the drug's clinical utility. Second, we allow manufacturers to raise those prices each year beyond inflation. And third, manufacturers extend their patent-protected market exclusivity by building a thicket of dozens or even hundreds of patents to delay generic entry. Other industrialized nations, even some states and payers in the US, have strategies that address these issues. The first step is to address excessive drug prices would be to evaluate and negotiate. The Defense Department isn't forced to buy every new weapon at the price Raytheon conceives of. It determines the product's usefulness and negotiates. The approach in other countries begins after regulatory approval with a process known as health technology assessment. in which independent organizations help determine a fair price based on how well the new drug performs against other available treatments. Only if a drug provides more benefit to patients should it cost more than other options. The US needs to establish a publicly funded body that would determine a price for a drug based on its clinical benefits. In Germany, drug evaluation and negotiation occurred during a drug's first year when a nonprofit, non-governmental research organization assesses its therapeutic benefits. In a review of outcomes in that market, we found that no drugs providing important benefit left the German market, while cancer drug prices substantially declined and were more closely aligned with clinical benefit. States like New York and Massachusetts have now initiated such a review process for their Medicaid programs. My second major recommendation is to limit drug price increases. In the US, Gleevec was introduced in 2001 for a list price of $26,000 a year and increased to more than $120,000 by 2016. Many brand name drugs provide rebates to commercial payers and Medicare Part D plans, but those only offset some of these price increases. By contrast, in other countries, agreements between the government or payers and manufacturers restrict price increases. We found that spending per unit for the cancer drug lenalidomide in the US increased from 2010 to 2018 from about $400 a unit to nearly $700 a unit, while during that same period of time, the drug in France decreased from $239 a unit to $202 a unit. One model would be to extend the drug price inflation rebate penalty currently in place for Medicaid. Bills were introduced in the prior Congress with bipartisan support for this plan, as Ranking Member Collins mentioned. A final component would be to arrange for more efficient transition to a competitive market. Generic or biosimilar entry is often delayed in the US because of patent thickets covering trivial attributes of the drug. Here again, lessons on how to improve experience in the US can come from other countries. Results from foreign patent offices suggest that the US Patent Office could reduce the number of wrongly issued patents by allocating greater resources to ensure patent quality. In addition, we could leverage the Patent Trial Appeals Board set up by the 2001 America Invents Act to weed out invalid patents before they get caught up in litigation by reviewing patents listed by the FDA. So there is my prescription, informed by successful policy initiatives in other countries and US states. Independent therapeutic evaluation leading to price negotiation, limits on price increases, and efficient generic entry at the end of market exclusivity. The industry may contend that any drug pricing reform will reduce innovation, but meaningful innovation need not decline. Large pharmaceutical manufacturers invest only about 10 to 20% of their revenues in R&D. To ensure new therapeutic insights, we must augment support of the NIH, since transformative drug innovation often emerges from publicly funded research and development, as it recently did for COVID-19 treatments and vaccines. In reality, these policies are likely to actually improve meaningful innovation. In the last decade, only 1/3 of new drugs in the US were rated by one of these international independent organizations as having even moderate therapeutic benefit. If drug prices more adequately reflected the clinical benefits that they offer to patients, this would incentivize more meaningful pharmaceutical innovation, and there would be less investment in making trivial changes to existing products and more investment in meeting unmet medical needs. Generous rewards would still be provided for creating important new medicines. Most importantly, with the changes I've proposed, policymakers can rest assured that more patients will be able to access these vital products at an affordable price. Thank you very much.
Dr. Kesselheim, thank you very, very much. Our next witness is Dr. Nav Prasad, who is the Canada Research Chair in Health Justice and Associate Professor at the University of Toronto. He's a staff physician and scientist at St. Michael's Hospital and Unity Health Toronto, where he provides care to patients and leads studies as part of the MAP Center for Urban Health Solutions. Dr. Prasad, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you and good morning. In Canada, per capita drug spending is $879 versus over $1,200 in the United States. Per capita spending is about 40% higher in the United States, largely because of the regulation of patented drug prices by the Canadian Patented Medicines Prices Review Board. Posted prices for patented medicines are approximately 3 times lower in Canada. The Patented Medicines Prices Review Board is slated in July to drop the United States from its list of comparator countries used to set price ceilings. because prices are shockingly high in the United States compared with other high-income countries, including the United Kingdom. The marketing of a raft of patented medicines during the 1990s boosted per capita spending disproportionately in the United States. The large rise in drug spending during the 1990s was partially due to patented opioid products such as OxyContin that was illegally marketed by Purdue Pharma on the lie that these medicines were safer and less expensive alternatives. Pharmaceutical companies continue to profit from the opioid crisis that killed approximately 80,000 Americans in the 12-month period ending in May of 2020. Pressure and lobbying by pharmaceutical companies have undermined reforms in both Canada and the United States. Multiple government reports over decades have recommended including medicines in Canada's publicly funded single-payer system to improve fair access and to save billions each year. But this has not happened, so we continue to pay high prices that comparable countries such as Norway and Australia, and inequities persist in Canada. America is a superpower that has not shown its strength in standing up to pharmaceutical companies that rip off Americans, as proven by the price differences for patented medicines across our border. My colleagues and I have conducted a randomized control trial of distributing essential medicines as per international guidance from the World Health Organization to people who report not being able to afford them. We found improvements in the control of blood pressure and diabetes, fewer missed medical appointments, and total healthcare savings that average more than $1,000 per patient per year. The biggest benefit was in the ability to make ends meet or afford basic necessities such as rent and food. Only 29% in the usual access or control group could make ends meet, but 86% of those who did not have to pay out of pocket for medicines could afford necessities. A farmer in our study, for example, was better able to grow food when he had his asthma puffers. Could publicly funding a list of essential medicines work in the United States? It already is working at the United States Veterans Administration. Since its creation in 1997, the VA's national formulary has led to improvements in care, and its negotiating power has led to impressive price reductions. The VA's approach of creating a rational list of medicines and then using proven methods to negotiate prices accords with international guidance. It's a model that could be adapted to an even larger scale in the United States. There are three key elements of government action to reduce drug spending while promoting access and equitable care. 1. Punish abusive pricing of patented medicines by creating a new bureau. Create a new bureau to set price ceilings for patented medicines. Give that bureau the resources and teeth to keep prices low, and empower that bureau to issue compulsory licenses when companies price patented medicines unreasonably. The new bureau should be able to cut annual drug spending by at least $100 billion. 2. Use negotiating power in open tendering processes to secure low prices on a defined set of essential medicines as per international guidance. Negotiating power can help to ensure equitable access to needed medicines, including off-patent or generic medicines. 3. Use existing legislation and additional political will to discipline the companies currently bloated by high medicine prices that illegally market products. There's a need for urgent action. Americans are getting ripped off by more than $100 billion per year, and this money in the wrong hands is used to illegally market medicines that kill Americans. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Prasad. Next, we have Miss Elia Spates, who lives in Derby, Vermont, who was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes when she was 18. Her struggles to manage the disease and the associated costs have transformed her into an advocate for lower drug prices and better health care. Ms. Spates, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you. My name is Elia Spates. I was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes 23 years ago, and quickly my parents and I got a crash course in the world of insurance and the serious expense of diabetes. The insulin that I take now costs over $2,000 out of pocket per month. The rise that I have seen in this price in the last 23 years is astronomical. In fact, from 2002 to 2013, the cost of insulin tripled. When you pay over $800 per month for an individual in insurance premiums and pay an additional $2,000 per month until your deductible is met, your family starts to feel a financial pinch. The only way you see to cut back on the spending is to cut back on the insulin. Before you know it, your diabetes is out of control, your blood sugars swing dramatically, seizures happen, and you are even found unresponsive. It's time to treat the disease seriously. The financial side of diabetes is as much or more a burden as the disease itself. I am certainly not the only diabetic out there who has rationed insulin to help fend off a steadily accumulating debt. In fact, 45% of diabetics at one time or another will compromise their care to cut their costs. However, what is happening is that those who are not as fortunate as I land themselves in the hospital in traumatic circumstances and may even die. 7.5 million Americans rely on insulin. 1.5 million of those are type 1 diabetics. A few years ago, my doctor suggested going to Canada. I live just 4 miles from the Canadian border, so this was logical. Until you give it just 1 ounce of thought. I pay over $10,000 a year in insurance premiums so that I can go buy my insulin in another country and it doesn't count toward my deductible. It is completely asinine to think that I would go to another country to buy inexpensive medication and yet pay for a healthcare plan in my own country that is only compounding my diabetic problems. Twice I have arrived at the pharmacy to pick up medication that had been prescribed by my doctor, and both times I was told that my insurance company was no longer going to cover that brand without prior authorization. However, they were happy to cover another suggested brand that was biosimilar but not bioequivalent. With this medication, it had taken me over a year to get it approved by the insurance company, and I was finally having success using it, and now it was being disallowed. It is infuriating to know that in one fell swoop, your perfect combination can be undone by the companies that produce the medication and the pharmacy benefits managers who market it to the insurance companies who now give it preferred status on their healthcare formularies. Just 6 months later, an insulin I had been on for over 4 years became no longer an option. Once again, it needed a prior authorization, but there was a similar medication that I could have. Now, had this been the difference in brand name to generic, I could have understood. However, this was from one brand name insulin to another, and in fact, it was $5 more out of pocket for me. It doesn't take a genius to figure out that this was happening because of how the money passes between the hands of the producers of the insulin, the PBMs, and the insurance companies. I appreciate being a part of a good business deal when I see one, and as a woman in business, I fully understand supply and demand. I was raised in the humanitarian principles of achieving success. Doing things ethically and watching the bottom line to make a profit is essential. It is, however, unethical, unscrupulous, and completely wrong to gouge people, particularly so at the expense of their health. To think that we are outpricing our own citizens and virtually holding out of reach scientific marvels to those who need it is an embarrassment. We have seen a 300% rise in our cost of insulin in just a matter of years, yet in the same amount of time, Canada has seen virtually no rise in cost at all. 3 major producers of insulin have all had the same price hikes over that time. It is interesting that pharmaceutical companies provide amazing rebates on these products, yet the bulk of the rebates are cashed in by the PBMs and not the consumers. This practice provides preferred status on the insurance company formularies for the pharmaceutical companies, hardly an arm's length transaction. Rebates alone have risen from 2% in 2013 to 56% in 2018. 100 years after the invention of insulin, there are of course generic insulins out there which have been formulated. My understanding is that they sit on a dark and dusty shelf in the back of the room titled Pay for Delay. This is that devious little plan in which big pharma companies pay off the generic companies to delay the release of their product. Big pharma gets to keep the largest part of their sales. The generic company makes even more than if they put it out on the market, and I continue to pay top dollar. Any middle school student working their vocabulary list can tell you that is the perfect description for collusion. There are days that it is almost impossible to contemplate the unethical, immoral American healthcare and pharmaceutical system that has been created out of greed. I have to believe that those who perpetuate it probably haven't been burned by it. It is more than likely that they don't feel the initial pressure of the extreme insurance premiums should really be given by our elementary school children because it is that simple. It is simply because of greed. We are fooling ourselves and the citizens of this country by behaving like we don't know why we pay more. We all know. The question just becomes, who is going to fix it? Who is going to put themselves out there? Who is going to take the high road and not the handout? Who is going to say lives are at stake here and for once put yourself in those shoes and do what you would want done for you, your parents, your wife, your brother, your son, your daughter? This is a bipartisan issue. Make it one. Do what's right, do it quickly, and then sleep well at night knowing you chose to help the people who, by voting, entrusted you with their well-being. Thank you.
Ms. Spates, thank you very much for your remarks. Our last panelist is Mr. Alex Brill, who is a resident fellow with the American Enterprise Institute, the public policy think tank in Washington, D.C. Previously, he served as chief economist and policy director to the House Committee on Ways and Means and on the staff of the White House Council of Economic Advisors. Mr. Brill has an MA in mathematical finance from Boston University and a BA in economics from Tufts University. Mr. Brill, thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you very much, Chairman Sanders. I must confess that power just went out here in my office, and I hope this connection via my cell phone works. I appreciate the opportunity to appear before the committee to testify on this important topic. As you mentioned, I'm a resident fellow with the American Enterprise Institute. My written testimony has been submitted to the committee for the record. It offers 3 broad observations and a series of policy recommendations, which I'll briefly summarize. First, perhaps predictably, is the importance of innovation in the pharmaceutical sector. Pharmaceutical innovation plays a critical role in improving health and well-being, and never has that been more important and more evident than today, as multiple highly effective coronavirus vaccines have been brought to the market in short order. These vaccines are the result not only of work that began after March 2020, but of decades of research funded by public and private investment, and of course, extraordinary support by the FDA. Policies to curb U.S. drug costs must ensure adequate reward for future innovation. This is not an endorsement of the status quo, but a recognition, rather, of the importance of new medicines. And second, with respect to drug spending, U.S. prescription drug spending was $368 billion in 2019, nearly 10% of national health expenditures. It's important, however, to note that the drivers of this cost. Biologics are driving much of the increase in national drug spending. In inflation-adjusted per capita terms, biologic drug spending increased from less than $300 to over $400 per capita from the period 2014 to 2018, while traditional small molecule drugs, pills, fell on an inflation-adjusted per capita basis during that same time. Notably, out-of-pocket spending, the patient's costs as a share of total drug spending has declined significantly over the last 2 decades, from roughly 28% to roughly 14% in 2019. Out-of-pocket costs for those with the highest expenses who are low and moderate income actually fell, and out-of-pocket costs for those patients with the highest costs rose for higher income individuals. Of course, however, these broad trends are important to recognize, but they can also mask high financial burdens experienced by some patients, as we've heard already this morning. And third, the importance of balance. The success of the U.S. pharmaceutical market is the result of a dual mandate embodied in the landmark 1984 legislation commonly known as Hatch-Waxman. Hatch-Waxman legislation sought to both allow meaningful rewards for new innovative drugs and to encourage a robust generic drug industry. Today, we have the pharmaceutical innovation I referenced a moment ago and a generic industry that fills 90% of all retail prescriptions, yet represents just 20% of overall drug spending. The average copays for generics is just $7. Our peer nations are not as successful. Across the OECD, just over half of all prescriptions are filled with generic medicines. There are, however, important opportunities to further foster competition and realize additional drug savings in the U.S. pharmaceutical market. My written testimony notes 6 areas where I believe bipartisan cooperation can ensure more timely entry of generics or biosimilars without discouraging the risk-taking innovation of brand medicines. Let me briefly highlight just 3. First, biosimilars. Biosimilars has already yielded roughly $37 billion in savings to the U.S. healthcare system, but more can be done. One approach would be to align the incentives of prescribers with payers and patients. This could be achieved with a proposal considered by the Finance Committee for ASP +8 for biosimilars, or the demonstration operated for Medicare Part B out of CMMI. Second, the importance of complex generic medicines and their approval here in the United States. Congress should ensure that the FDA has the incentives and the resources to promptly review and approve complex generic applications. In some recent work, I've estimated that 7 such products which are not available here but are available in Canada or Europe, bringing them to the United States could save $1.3 billion a year annually. And finally, patent thickets, as noted earlier. Innovator drug companies are building patent thickets around lucrative products by obtaining myriad overlapping patents, many of those patents submitted after the launch of the initial product. To deter generic challengers or biosimilar challengers is the pure intent of these efforts. Without policy reform, these tactics will become the playbook for all innovator companies in the future. Thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Brill. Let me start off the questioning. Let me ask a very simple question, and that is I recall that about a year and a half ago, I took a trip from Detroit, Michigan, into Ontario with a number of folks from the Midwest who were diabetic. And we purchased insulin, the same product made by the same company, for 1/10 of the price, 10% of the price. Somebody jump in, Dr. Kesselheim, Dr. Brassode. Why is it that in Canada, tell us simply, you can purchase the same exact widely used product for 1/10 the price that it costs in the United States?
Rob, you're the Canadian.
Thanks for the question, Senator. 2 reasons. First, patented medicines have their prices regulated in Canada, and because there is not going to be competition, if you want to pay a reasonable price for patented products, you have to regulate the prices. That's what's done in other high-income countries, not just in Canada.
Is there any other country, let me interrupt you, I apologize. Is there any other country, major country on earth that does not in one way or another regulate the price of drugs or allow the companies to charge any price they want? Is any other country other than the United States that allows that?
No.
Okay. Dr. Kesselheim, did you want to jump in on that?
Sure. No, there is no other country that does that. We are unique in the world in allowing the pharmaceutical company to charge whatever price they want. And as a result, the only intervention in the U.S. market that actually lowers prices is the availability of interchangeable generics, which unfortunately for insulin, we don't have any. And as a result, prices have not fallen because there's no pressure, no market pressure, no government pressure, no pressure at all on the pharmaceutical companies that sell insulin to lower their prices to the same extent that there is in Canada.
All right, let me ask the doctors another question. It is estimated that 1 out of 4 Americans cannot afford the prescription drugs their doctors prescribe. What does this mean for the health of the American people? If I'm sick and I go to a doctor and the doctor writes a script for me and I can't fill it, what impact does that have on health in the United States?
I think it has a critically important impact. There are numerous studies showing that the high price of drugs can lead to non-adherence, which is when patients don't fill their prescription or they extend their prescription or use less of the medicine in ways that ultimately are harmful to them. And some studies led by people in our group here at the Division of Pharmacoepidemiology show that when people are prescribed higher cost medicines instead of equally effective lower cost medicines, that can lead to worse patient outcomes. So it is truly something that is problematic for patients and something that we can fix.
Let me ask you this, and I think Dr. Brassode, you may have done a study on this. Tell me what I'm missing here, but if I cannot afford my medicine and I get sicker than I should be, and maybe I end up in the emergency room, maybe I end up in the hospital, is it possible in fact, that we end up spending more on healthcare because people simply cannot afford the medicine that they need.
Yes, Senator, that's exactly what we found in our study. When we provided medicines to people who could not afford them, we realized savings of more than $1,000 per year per patient. And that was due to avoided hospitalizations, avoided emergency room visits. We're talking about life-saving medicines that we know work, treatments for high blood pressure and diabetes. So when people are able to take their medications, they are healthier. We've also found that people find it easier to make ends meet, to afford their rent and food. And these are things, healthy housing, healthy foods that people need to be healthy as well.
So what you are saying is that the high cost of prescription drugs result in people getting sicker than they should, and in fact, ending up costing healthcare systems more money than we should be expending.
Yes, you're paying at least twice. Once the higher price for medicines, and second when people land in the hospital with a heart attack or a stroke.
Which could have been prevented.
Absolutely preventable.
Okay, Senator Collins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before I begin my questions, I would ask unanimous consent that a statement from Senator Burr be submitted for the record.
Without objection.
Thank you. Mr. Brill, you mentioned the role of patent thickets in blocking access to more affordable biosimilars. You also talked about the fact that biologics are very expensive and are consuming an increasing amount of the cost of prescription drugs in this country. Even though there are several biosimilars for the best-selling drug in the world, Humira, and they've been on the market in the European Union since 2018, American patients must wait another 2 years for them to be available here due to the manufacturer's aggressive patent thickened strategy of overlapping and late filed patents. Another method of fending off biosimilar competition is called a drip feed strategy, where knowledge broadly disclosed in early patent applications is defined much more narrowly and specifically in subsequent patent applications. And AbbVie is using this strategy for a cancer drug that it has. How should Congress ensure that we are recognizing innovative science versus rewarding an innovative legal strategy that is simply designed to block more affordable competitors by gaming the patent system?
Thank you, Senator, for your question. The issue of patent thickets and related patenting strategies employed by some innovator companies is, I think, should be very concerning to policymakers. I think we're in the early innings of what will become an evolving set of tools that many innovator drug companies may engage with to protect their assets. And this runs completely counter to the objectives of competition for biosimilars or for other innovative products. We have these pathways through the FDA to create and foster generic competition, biosimilar competition, and the patent system is getting in the way. I know that you have introduced in the past legislation with Senator Kaine, Senator Cornyn, and Senator Blumenthal also have legislation focused on addressing these issues, finding ways to protect core patents and appropriate patents, but to block or prevent the ability of innovators to stack patents on top of each other and create undue, unnecessary, excessive monopoly powers for their products.
Thank you. I think this is an area that cries out for reform. Dr. Kesselheim, the Veterans Administration has some authority to negotiate favorable pricing and deeper discounts. But we also hear complaints that they have a national formulary, and we get complaints in my state offices from veterans who need drugs that are not available on that formulary. So how do we come up, if we move to a broader use of negotiation by the federal government, while still ensuring that there is patient choice of medications, that their physicians can still prescribe and they can get reimbursed under the terms of their insurance for the medications that are best suited for them?
Thank you, Senator Collins. It's a great question and an important one. And I think that the principles that I was outlining are really a principle of evaluating the effectiveness of drugs and negotiating on that basis, and not necessarily about restricting access to the products, but providing coverage to products that are extremely effective, and not providing the same level of coverage to products that don't offer additional benefits. And so that's the model that some states have used, like New York and Massachusetts are starting to employ to try to negotiate prices better for their Medicaid programs. It just involves evaluating the utility of a drug as compared to standard of care, and then paying for the drug if it offers more, but not providing the same level of coverage if it doesn't offer any additional benefits. And those organizations have found substantial success thus far in implementing that kind of a model.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Collins. Senator Casey.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for having this hearing today. I want to commend you for having the hearing, and you and the ranking member for doing this. Because when so many of us go home and talk to our constituents, one of several big bags of rocks on the shoulders of American families is the cost of prescription drugs. We hear it all the time. Everyone does, no matter where you're from. And the other bags of rocks on their back or their shoulder are the cost of childcare or higher education or healthcare generally. So we have an obligation to act, and I've heard it from folks all across Pennsylvania. Just by way of one quick example, a constituent of mine, Barbara Sissick, she's from Rural Ridge, Pennsylvania. She testified before a committee, an aging committee hearing that Senator Collins chaired in 2019. Barbara pays as much as $500 per month for multiple medications to manage bleeding ulcers, high blood pressure, and more. So people like Barbara, so many like her across the country, expect us to take action. So I've supported, and I know this is true of a number of senators, legislation to take steps in the right direction. Whether it's the legislation to allow Medicare to use its purchasing power to negotiate prescription drug prices, or whether it's legislation like Senator Sanders has to allow for the importation of prescription drugs from countries like Canada that have similar regulations in place to ensure that drugs are safe and effective. I also have legislation I've authored to expand low-income protections for seniors and people with disabilities to make sure they can afford Medicare premiums and out-of-pocket costs. So with regard, and I'll direct my question to Dr. Prasad, with regard to Senator Sanders' legislation for drug importation, allowing Americans to purchase drugs from Canada, from countries like Canada that have comparable regulations in place. I'd ask you this simple question, Doctor. Can you tell us and give us an answer to the following question? Do you believe the prescription drugs sold in Canada are safe and effective?
Thank you, Senator. Yes, they're safe and effective, and they're the type of medicines that America, the superpower, should be able to negotiate reasonable prices for. Canada is a relatively small country, population around 37 million, and the United States can implement measures to regulate prices of patented medicines and negotiate prices for other medicines. Between Canada and the United States, there's only one superpower, and really it should be Canada hiding behind the United States when it takes on pharmaceutical companies.
And Doctor, one follow-up to that, just in terms of the types of controls in place, the policies in place that Canadian authorities have to make sure that prescription drugs are safe and effective for consumers. If you could just walk through that in summary fashion.
Sure. So first of all, Health Canada regulates every product here. Health Canada has the power to inspect facilities, including overseas facilities where many medications consumed in Canada are produced. Standards would be similar to countries like the United States, similar to other high-income countries like the United Kingdom and countries in Europe.
Doctor, thanks very much. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Casey. Senator Murkowski.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for this very important hearing. This is going to be a question to Dr. Kesselheim. And this stems from a story that we had heard from a constituent in Wasilla, not too far north from Fairbanks, but they have indicated that they've been paying $633 for a 3-month supply of her inhaler. The price of the inhaler increased in January for the 3rd year in a row. And like so many, they just don't get it. You know, why do we keep seeing these price increases? So Dr. Kesselheim, in your experience with this year-to-year price hikes on prescription drugs, in your view, what's prompting it? Do they usually result from changes or improvements to the drug's efficacy? Because I think if it was going to improve the drug, we can understand why that might be. Or is it because they are resulting from increased manufacturing costs or R&D? What do you tell somebody like this constituent in Wasilla?
It's a very challenging issue, and no, it doesn't arise for any of those things. It arises because manufacturers have, pharmaceutical companies have investors that they need to, maintain their profit margins for. And one of the ways that they can do that is if they have an approved product is by raising the price on that product year after year. And unfortunately, in the case of inhalers, we have a lot of the same issues that we have with insulin, where manufacturers are able to get new patents on the not on the underlying medicine itself, but on the inhaler device. And those patents prevent the FDA from approving interchangeable versions of the product that might lower the prices. And of course, we also just don't do any negotiation with manufacturers over the prices that they charge for their products. And as a result of all of those things, that gives manufacturers substantial freedom to raise their prices far beyond inflation on a year-over-year basis, and leads to the problems like you're describing for your constituent.
So do we have any way to determine whether these price hikes are justified? What you've just outlined to me, I don't think that's going to be satisfactory to this individual in Wasilla. How can we know whether or not, when you have reformatted the device for the inhaler, that somehow or other increases the efficacy? Is there any way to determine whether these price hikes are justifiable?
Sure. So, one of the ways you would do that is you might actually conduct a clinical trial in which you tested your new version against the old version and showed that one was superior. Most pharmaceutical companies don't fund that kind of comparative effectiveness research. Instead, they just rely on marketing to promote the new improved product. I would also say that if we did have a publicly funded independent organization that evaluated the effectiveness of products and helped negotiate prices, if in fact a product was substantially improved by virtue of a change in manufacturing practice or something like that, then theoretically the pharmaceutical manufacturer could submit that information to the organization, and it could be fairly reviewed, and the price could be increased if it was fair to do so.
Well, Mr. Chairman, we hear these stories all the time. This is the reason that we're having this hearing this morning. Senator Baldwin and I have reintroduced what we call the Fair Drug Pricing Act, which would require the manufacturers to actually provide some kind of a justification when we see these substantial increases to the list price for the medications. I think we recognize that People want to see some level of transparency here and accountability when you see these really sometimes incredible price hikes year over year over year. So I would hope that we'd be able to advance provisions like what Senator Baldwin and I are trying to do along with leadership on this committee. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Murkowski. And now we go to Senator Baldwin.
Thank you, Chair Sanders. And I want to jump in just where Senator Murkowski dropped off with regard to the Fair Drug Pricing Act. But I also want to share a constituent experience first. I hear all the time from Wisconsinites who cannot afford their prescription medication. People like Jackie Trapp from Muskego, Wisconsin, who has terminal cancer. She wrote me that the drug that keeps me alive is also driving my family towards bankruptcy. It has doubled in price in the very few years I've been on it, and it costs me $15,000 to $21,000 out of pocket per year. My husband is worried enough about being left alone, and I worry about him having to start over financially in his 60s as our lifetime of savings is being wiped out from one drug, Revlimid. The price of this drug, Revlimid, has increased over 20 times. Stories like this one are the inspiration for the Bipartisan Fair Drug Pricing Act, which I'm reintroducing today with my colleagues, Senator Murkowski, Senator Smith, Senator Braun. The bill requires manufacturers to submit a transparency and justification report 30 days before they increase the price of a drug by more than 10% in 1 year or 25% over 3 years. This is a first step, but it's a really important one. For the first time, it gives taxpayers and patients advance notice of price increases, but it brings basic transparency to the market for prescription drugs. Dr. Kesselheim, why is it important to require manufacturers to publicly justify their price increases, including by accounting for things like research and development costs, net profits attributed to the drug, and marketing and advertising spending? And what is the impact of transparency requirements when it comes to the list prices of medications?
Thank you, Senator. So I would say that one of the reasons it's important to require companies to disclose this information to a board or some other means is, first of all, to give them the incentive to actually generate information that would justify the price increase. Right now, pharmaceutical companies can raise prices without any justification and without doing any research. And if you require some kind of disclosure, you could actually incentivize companies to generate high quality research information that could then help guide physician and patient choices, could provide more usefulness. I think another to helping guide prescribing practices. And again, another thing that such a measure could do would be to actually dissuade companies from making those from increasing prices when they don't have that information, or when they don't have a justification, or if they don't want to provide insight into their marketing budgets. And so could actually, prevent these kinds of price hikes from happening in the first place, unless they are really truly justified by some kind of, change in the supply chain or manufacturing practices.
Thank you. I want to continue in this vein. From 2010 to 2019, the FDA approved 356 drugs. Recent research from Bentley University finds that NIH funding contributed to every single new drug approved, at a cost to the taxpayer of roughly $230 billion. In spite of this contribution, the NIH is listed on only 27 of those patents. This suggests that while taxpayers provide funding for the bulk of the early stage research, they do not get patent protections supposedly secured by the Bayh-Dole Act. In essence, American taxpayers are paying the highest prices in the world for drugs that they already paid to help develop. Dr. Kesselheim, are American taxpayers getting a fair deal for this research investment? And how should we be looking at and examining and accounting for the taxpayer contributions? And what could this mean ultimately for drug prices if we got it right?
Well, I mean, I think that Americans are getting advantages when the products that are developed by public funding end up leading to important new treatments, like as we saw the COVID-19 vaccines or other transformative drugs. Research from our group has shown that by far transformative drugs are much more likely to come out of public funding and NIH resources. So I mean, I think what this shows is that first of all, it shows the limitations of the patent system as a way of assigning credit for where products come from, because you can't get a patent until you are at the much more closer to the final stages of cost of development. And even for those drugs, though, we don't end up providing a lot of recognition of the public's support for those products in the prices that patients provide, and as a result, some people argue that patients are paying twice for the drugs, first in the research leading up to their discovery, and then second in the super high prices that we pay because we don't have any control over the prices in the U.S. market.
I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, thank you so much, Chairman. And I just want to emphasize that you and I, both sides of the aisle, agree on the same goal here, that we want to figure out affordable access to all prescriptions for all people, and just bring some of my insight as a physician to this committee. And I think I want to talk about insulin just for a second, and I appreciate your person's testimony on this. This is a prescription I've written for thousands of times, and it's part of this opaque game. I call it the opaque game. There's a list price and a net price. The list price of insulin has gone up thousands of times %. And that's what the out-of-pocket is based upon. So the person that testified today, the Medicare patient, whoever, they're paying out-of-pocket based on the list price. But the net price, in many instances, has gone down since 2007. And this is where the opaque process happens. As far as I know, this is the only business in America that's allowed to have legal kickbacks. So there are legal kickbacks from the middlemen to big pharma, as well as insurance companies, and we don't know who else. And that's the opaque process. There's clawbacks from community pharmacists, and subsequently we're losing more community pharmacies than ever before. And I think there's two simple solutions. The first one is transparency. I think if my parents, 83 years of age, living in the home that I grew up in, who balance their checkbook every day, don't have a credit card, if they would see where those kickbacks are going, they would raise Cain. And I think that all of Congress could see that. And I think the second step is to eliminate kickbacks, that these kickbacks have to stop and all rebates should go to the patient. So those are the two solutions I hope we could agree to work upon. I want to turn and talk about innovation, though, how innovation is important as well. That I think that of all the top 10 drugs that are in the world today over the last 4 or 5 years were all discovered, made here in America. But I think this goes to my point on process. Ventolin inhalers is another great example. One of our folks talked about that. Ventolin inhalers, something I've written thousands of prescriptions for. And about 5-6 years ago, I was writing a prescription, and it was an OB patient, so she came back in a week and said, Dr. Marshall, I think you gave the wrong prescription. It went from $28 to $168. And I said, oh, no, that's a generic. Your pharmacist must have made a mistake. Let me pick up the phone and call and talk to him. And sure enough, what we found out is the EPA had decided all the dispensers but one were not environmentally friendly. It gave one person control of that entire market. And I said, well, certainly someone will break onto the world scene here and make a new dispensing unit. But I found out it would take 5 to 10 years and $1 billion perhaps to get that certified. So there's multiple opportunities here to improve that process. And I know that some of my colleagues have legislation that would do that as well. I really think it's important that we protect innovation, and my question is going to go to Mr. Brill on this. You know, as I think about the miracles of COVID, in January 2020, I reached out to the CDC to tell them my concern about the COVID virus, and they weren't quite as concerned as I was, and so I immediately turned to the private sector. And as the CDC kind of failed rolling out their testing, I asked the private sector to start working on testing, on therapeutics, and on vaccines, knowing that this was going to be a world problem very, very soon. And thanks to those folks, a miracle, occurred, and we were able to develop a vaccine in months. What typically takes 5 or 10 years, they did in months. We implemented many processes that were improved, the FDA process of approval, that I think that should be looked at long-term as well. So anyway, I think there's this balance between innovation, encouraging innovation, and not stifling it with government price controls versus not allowing innovation to occur. So, Mr. Brill, let me just give you a second here to kind of speak about balancing this innovation and the cost of medicines and price controls. What would price controls do to innovation in America?
Thank you, Senator, for your question. Obviously, policymakers are interested in both of these objectives, both ensuring new and innovative medicines, and the vaccines that are becoming more and more available every day are the clearest example of that. And this science was developed over years, public and private investments together. We want to make sure to nurture and promote and facilitate this type of research and these investments over time. And quite frankly, the credit goes not only to those manufacturers who have successfully brought products to market so far, but to all of the researchers who are working on vaccines, including those, quite frankly, whose efforts have failed. That's the innovative process that we want to foster. How to balance that against our desires to keep prices low is the challenge. And in my view, the answers to those challenges are best met by finding ways to create more competition rather than more price controls in the market. And that means more generics, not just a generic, but multiple generics to compete, making sure that those generics are allowed onto the market in a timely fashion. And the other type of competition that can be important is what's referred to as brand-to-brand competition. This often doesn't have the kind of effects we would like to see on list prices, but can have that kind of positive effects that we're hoping for on net prices, which are an important price in the system as well.
Yeah, thank you so much, and I yield back.
Thank you, Senator Marshall. Senator Kane.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for holding this hearing, a very important one. And I just want to begin by thanking Ms. Spates. I hope I pronounce her name correctly. I was not here for your verbal testimony because I was in 2 other hearings, but I read your written testimony, and it's extremely powerful. And your conclusion that we pay more than other nations because of greed, I think, is partially accurate, but I think the other reason we pay more is because of us, Congress. If we have a set of rules, people will, operate under the rules as they exist, and then they'll maximize the money they can make. And I think we might wish it were otherwise, but we can't pretend it is otherwise. And so that puts the burden on our shoulders, Ms. Spates, to come up with rules that will lead a person like you to not look 5 miles across a border and see people with similar health conditions to you who are not, taxed to the very edge of their resources to deal with diabetes as you are living near the Canadian border. So thank you for basically encouraging us to do things to get this right. I'm happy to have been working with Senator Collins on legislation dealing with biosimilars and trying to get biosimilars to the market quicker, because I think there's cost savings in there if we can do that right. But let me do a couple of things. And forgive me, Mr. Chair, if I may have missed questions like this when I was at the other hearings, but I want to ask Dr. Kesselheim, if I could, about international reference pricing. I raised with the previous administration the notion that we pay so much more than other nations do, and many nations in negotiating for pricing of prescription drugs use international benchmarks as a basis of negotiation. I actually thought that was one of the things that the Trump administration attempted to do that I thought was a really good idea. We don't have to pay the same price that a third world nation does. I understand the notion of discounting pricing to nations with a lot of poor people so that they can have access to medicines. But when we pay dramatically more than other developed nations, I think the international reference pricing idea is a good one. Dr. Kesselheim, could that be helpful as part of a broader pharmaceutical price reduction strategy?
Certainly, Senator Kane. Certainly, Senator Kane. I think that when you engage in international reference pricing, what you're doing is you're looking at other countries and asking what are the prices that they're paying for the exact same drug that you're paying for. And in many cases, what those countries are doing is they are assessing the clinical benefits of the drug and determining what a fair price should be. And so really, when you're doing international reference pricing, you're doing the exact same thing that I recommended we do up front, which is evaluate and negotiate, except we would just not be doing it. We would be relying on other countries doing it and then piggybacking on the conclusions that they made. So I think that international reference pricing might be a good fallback and maybe a good way of setting parameters. But I really think that the U.S. Could and should be able to make those same kinds of assessments and negotiations ourselves.
And Dr. Kesselheim, it interests me as I see pharmaceutical companies oppose this, because to me, the notion of international reference pricing is kind of like capitalism. Why wouldn't we want to negotiate? I mean, why wouldn't we want to look at the prices that others are paying and try to negotiate? I was a lawyer, and for years, you'd negotiate a provision in a contract that if you offer a lower price to somebody else, I get it too. I mean, that just seems to be basic bargaining 101. Why wouldn't the U.S. Engage in basic negotiating tactics in the way that other countries do?
I think you're absolutely right that they should do that, and the U.S. should, given the fact that it's such a large market, should be able to leverage the size of its market to be able to get lower prices. I think that actually that raises an interesting point, and another concern that I have about international reference pricing, which is that pharmaceutical companies often give other countries secret discounts on top of their list prices. So the list price that we see in another country might not actually be the real price that country pays. So we would be international reference pricing off of maybe not exactly the actual price for the product, again, which suggests that while international reference pricing is a good model, what we really should be doing is doing those same kinds of evaluation and negotiation here in the U.S.
And then while we're on the negotiation topic, I'm sure this has already been raised, but I've just always been struck by the fact that the U.S. does not negotiate for prescription drug pricing under Medicare Part D, but we do allow the VA to negotiate prices of prescription drugs. How much might we save in Medicare Part D if the Medicare program was able to use the same negotiation strategy that the VA uses?
Great question, and we've done a number of studies actually led by Will Feldman in our group to look at what that difference might be. And he found in looking at the insulin prices, for example, that Medicare could save billions of dollars each year if Medicare was able to negotiate and use its leverage in the same way that the VA is able to do that.
And that would be billions of dollars for in the federal treasury for deficit relief or whatever else we want to do, but it would also be substantial consumer savings, wouldn't it?
And that's just one drug for 1 year. And so if you imagine how much that would be for all of the drugs that have been on the market for multiple years and have reached really high prices. And yes, that would then also translate to improved consumer savings and lower prices for lower healthcare premiums, which might translate to higher wages, and I think it would affect the entire economy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Kane. Senator Cassidy.
Hello, folks. Mr. Brill, the Orphan Drug Act was supposed to, I'm sorry, I got a glare behind me. The Orphan Drug Act was supposed to incent, and has incented, the development of drugs for people for conditions which are of a low prevalence. But we know that some drugs would start off for those with a low prevalence, end up, by the way, you're getting a tour of my kitchen. So anyway, they end up for other conditions, but the same high price and exclusivity for the orphan drug then translates over to the more common condition. What thoughts do you have about how we can address that? We want the orphan drug benefit, but we also don't want this kind of arbitrage where it then introduces a higher price than it should be for something else.
Thank you, Senator Cassidy. As you may know, I think 7 out of the top 10 drugs being sold in the United States today were granted orphan drug exclusivities. And as you mentioned, the underlying principle here is desirable. There are rare diseases for which there may be underinvestment in R&D for products to treat those conditions, and some existing medicines may help in those smaller patient populations. However, the current structure creates this very strong incentive to pursue orphan drug designation and thereby extending the monopoly power across the sales of all drugs. Policymakers need to think about this in sort of in careful balance, and what is the appropriate amount of incentive to provide manufacturers and researchers to make sure that they know if their products are effective in small populations without extending the monopolies for over a large
Mr. Brill, I know that, man. I need some legislation. So what's my legislation going to read? How do we thread that needle?
Well, the actual solution, I would say that we want to think about the standards for which those exclusivities are granted. It shouldn't be just for investigations, but for meaningful progress and meaningful treatment in those. And we could think about engaging with the FDA and helping to make those determinations so that it's not excessively awarded.
Dr. Kesselheim, you had mentioned the federal government negotiating with manufacturers, but this would be basically, in some cases, the United States government would be a purchaser of 99% of the drug produced. Think a prospective Alzheimer's drug. So, so-called monopsony power, a single purchaser. And certain oncolytics would be basically the federal government buying no one else. It seems to me that could have a chilling effect upon a company's willingness to invest in a drug if they thought the federal government was going to be able to unilaterally set the price. If a President Bernie Sanders decided that we're going to go to negotiating drugs, who would invest in developing an Alzheimer's drug knowing that the return on investment from Medicare would be so poor? Your thoughts on that?
Sure. Thank you, Senator. So I would say, first of all, I would think that, there are certainly a lot of scientists out there, trying to find treatments and effective cures for Alzheimer's disease, a disease that we do not have any effective treatments for. And I think that their work will continue. But I would also say that if we do have a publicly funded but independent board that evaluates new products.
Now, that's not my question. My question is in the venture capital and the people that fund that translational research from the bench, the dedicated scientists, to the clinical trial, which so far have been very fruitless and very expensive, but they're expecting a return on investment. What return would they expect? Again, if Bernie Sanders was president and you were his chief negotiator, yes, you could have somebody do an independent evaluation, but oftentimes government puts its finger on the scale. So how do we avoid that trap of squelching innovation when the federal government would be expected to give a very poor return on investment?
Well, I don't necessarily think that the federal government would be expected to give a poor return on investment, because if there is a new drug, especially for a condition like Alzheimer's that doesn't have any good treatments, if a new drug was out there and it offered an extremely substantial benefit to patients with Alzheimer's disease, I would think that under this current system, we would pay a lot of money for that drug because it would help reduce so much excess spending on, care.
There's a New York Times. I'll dispute a little bit because there's a New York Times article basically saying we should march in on drug companies' technology to make the COVID-19 vaccine, which is to say they've invested so much to put out a vaccine so quickly, but now we're going to force you to share your technology with others. I think there's always going to be this populist impulse to give something away for free. Are you saying that that would not be operative if there was a drug for Alzheimer's?
Well, I think that that's true. It does not have to operate. In fact, we see in places like Germany, they are able to negotiate and get prices out on the market and offer prices for which pharmaceutical manufacturers make a substantial profit in that market, and be able to come to valid negotiations without having to go to that extreme circumstance of having to march in or do whatever else. I think that there is a lot of opportunity to identify what a evidence-based valid price for a product should be, and that price would provide substantial incentives for investment because, you know, in cases of diseases like Alzheimer's disease, where there's substantial unmet medical need, that price could be quite high, but the system will end up affording the high price for that important new drug because we're not paying for all of the, you know, 8th and 9th products in a you know, for rheumatoid arthritis that don't offer any advantages over what products we already have. And so we'll save money on those ends, and as a result, we'll be able to pay a lot more money for really meaningful new innovation like the kind that you're describing.
I yield. Out of time, I'll just finish by saying, one, I think you underestimate a politician's tendency to give things away for free, particularly when they belong to other people. And secondly, the German model has been criticized for having such a restrictive clinical benefit aspect that indeed it's just not fair. But that said, the overall gist of we pay too much for drugs, I'm certainly in agreement with. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield.
Senator Hassan.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair and our ranking member. I want to thank the witnesses for being here today as well, and to Ms. Spates in particular. Thank you for true and clear and therefore compelling testimony, and for being willing to talk about your own personal situation. It makes a real difference. Mr. Chairman, I appreciate your work on this issue over the years, including on importation and allowing the federal government to negotiate Medicare drug prices. I believe there's bipartisan support in the Senate for legislation that meaningfully lowers the cost of prescription drugs, and we need to take action this year. I want to ask questions to you, Dr. Kesselheim, following up on Senator Baldwin's line of questioning. Drug companies often try to justify high prices by saying that they use this revenue to fund innovation for future breakthrough medications. And we all support innovations that effectively treat and cure diseases, but we also know that American taxpayers subsidize a significant portion of the research that leads to these innovations. So, Dr. Kesselheim, let's just make clear who makes the majority of investments in the research that leads to breakthrough therapies and treatments for unmet health needs. Is it the drug companies or the American taxpayer?
Well, I mean, I think it is. You know, there is usually a combination of factors that go into these kinds of discoveries, and so our studies have shown, and other studies have shown, that a substantial amount of basic and translational science, the vast majority of basic and translational science, is funded by publicly funded systems, and then privately funded entities come in later in the phase in the development process to lead you know, clinical trials and the regulatory approval process. So it is a little bit of a you know, sort of a combination of both forces. But our study.
But I'm going to just stop you because I want to get to other questions too.
Sure.
But it is a substantial amount of this innovation funding comes from the American taxpayer.
Yes, and the origins of particular, as you mentioned, the origins of transformative drugs often come from publicly funded sources, even through proof of concept and some you know, clinical testing of them.
Okay, so now let's move on to the broader topic here. Drug companies receive taxpayer support at just about every step of their business model, from the time a drug is developed to the time a pharmacy dispenses it to a patient. We are the only country that subsidizes these companies the way we do, yet according to a recent RAND study, we are paying up to 250% more for prescription drugs than countries with similar GDP. Dr. Kesselheim, I want to ask you about some of the tax breaks and subsidies that drug companies receive from American taxpayers. And I have several examples to get through in a limited amount of time, so if you can keep your answers brief, that would be helpful. Drug companies receive billions of dollars in tax credits that subsidize the cost of ads that they run on television, online, and in print. Have these tax credits led to lower drug prices or more innovation for patients?
No.
Okay, now drug companies also establish charities that promote the drugs that they sell and receive tax deductions when they donate to those charities. A Citi research report found that every $1 million a drug company donates to these charities can return up to $21 million in increased revenue. Briefly, if you can, Dr. Kesselheim, why are drug companies choosing to put billions of dollars into these charities instead of simply lowering the price of their drugs?
Well, those charities can help people who have high out-of-pocket costs and have no other choices but to take that drug. But what, as a result of helping individual patients with their high out-of-pocket costs, drug companies are making a lot of money on the payments that insurance companies make that are behind the scenes and are be able to sustain the high prices so that they can charge high prices for other payers.
Right, so they could just lower their prices overall, and that would make a difference for the patients. We do have some transparency, though, through the Medicare Open Payments database into payments drug companies make to prescribers. In 2019, companies gave away $2.3 billion in cash payments, free meals, and speaking fees, an average of over $3,700 to each prescriber who received a payment. And research shows that these payments influence prescribing. Dr. Kesselheim, why are companies choosing to spend billions of dollars each year on payments to prescribers instead of putting the money toward lowering the price of their drugs?
Well, those prices actually increase drug prices because they go to encourage physicians to prescribe the high-priced products over lower-priced generic drugs because generic manufacturers don't advertise their products.
Well, thank you, Dr. Kesselheim. These are just a few examples of the uniquely American tools that the drug industry has at its disposal, so it should be no surprise that the cost of prescription drugs in America are uniquely high. Thank you again, Mr. Chairman. I look forward to continuing this important work with you and our colleagues.
Thank you, Senator Hassan. Senator Rosen.
Thank you, Chairman Sanders, Ranking Member Collins, for holding this very important hearing today, and to the witnesses for sharing your perspectives on drug pricing. We have to do some work in this area for sure. But I'd like to continue the talk about innovation and competition and transparency that all of my colleagues have been discussing in some form or fashion, because Nevada is home to a number of smaller pharmaceutical firms. We're developing new drugs, medical devices, to improve lives, not only in our state, but of course across the country. In Southern Nevada, one company is working on an oral drug to treat lung cancer. Northern Nevada, another company is working on a drug to prevent Parkinson's, other neurologic diseases. And we know, again, research, development, clinical trials, they can take 10 years or more, and startup costs do remain a significant barrier, but the new drugs on the market will ultimately increase competition and help reduce costs. So Dr. Kesselheim, what more can Congress do or should do to support our smaller, local, startup pharmaceutical firms? They're taking on significant risks to develop these new innovative drugs and devices that may eventually really help increase access and lower costs, not to mention saving lives or improving lives.
Well, thank you for the question. I think that there are a number of things that government could do. I mean, I think that the example that we've seen in the last year relating to COVID innovation has shown the power that public-private partnerships can have when there is funding for, particularly for, really innovative new ideas to try to treat lung cancer, in this case, through some novel mechanism. I think that a lot of small companies will suggest that they unfortunately can't get the support that they need to try to get the, sort of move these drugs through proof of concept, in part because, the incentives are not necessarily there to support really important new products. So I think that one of the things that we could do is we could provide more upfront support for that. But in those cases, I think we also need to make sure that when those products then do become available, that they're being made available at a fair price for consumers.
Thank you. I want to say I'm particularly interested in the lung cancer drug. My mother passed away from lung cancer, and I would not wish that on anyone else. So I hope that we do see some movement forward on that. But I'm also interested in our nonprofit pharmaceutical company model. And so can you talk about this, your understanding of this relatively newer model and some of the challenges of bringing a drug or a device to market as a nonprofit? And how can the success we've seen so far in Congress from this, what can we do to support it and help that to grow in the nonprofit sector?
One of the most prominent nonprofit drug development models is the Drugs for Neglected Disease initiatives in Europe, and what they've been able to accomplish in getting new effective treatments for neglected tropical diseases in countries around the world for relatively meager support just shows how effective pharmaceutical development can operate on a limited budget. And these numbers that we're hearing about the cost of drug development are overinflated for a number of different ways. So I think that based on the success of models like that, there have been some efforts in the United States to try to develop nonprofit drug manufacturers. Mostly those products, those kinds of organizations operate to to meet to address drug shortages or other older off-patent products for which manufacturers have stopped manufacturing it. And we're starting to see some success. But I think that is an effective model for potentially an effective model for an important new drug that can't get the private funding that it needs in order to bring that product to market as well.
Thank you. I'd like to move on in the quick time I have left. The 340B drug discount program is critical to Nevada. We have a diverse population, hundreds of thousands of people living in rural communities spread out across our state. Can you talk about the importance of the 340B drug discount program, how it's helped increase access and affordability, please?
Sure. Well, so the 340B program is a very complicated system that we have to try to provide certain drugs at a relatively low cost to safety net hospitals. And it has provided a lot of useful drugs to low-income patients. It has expanded over the years, perhaps beyond what was originally intended by it. And as a result, there have been some discussions about whether, to what extent, certain hospitals should qualify as 340B hospitals or not. But there's no doubt that 340B pricing is among the best prices that we offer for certain high-cost drugs.
Thank you. I really appreciate you being here today. I yield back.
Thank you, Senator Rosen. Senator Braun.
Thank you, Chairman Sanders. So glad we're having the discussion on healthcare costs in general, specifically on the high costs of drugs. Everybody in our country sooner or later comes across a prescription that they wrestle with, have no idea how to attain the price in the first place in terms of a fair price. The lack of transparency that is systemic throughout our healthcare system is, in my opinion, the main reason why we're here today. In building a business over the years, if I had the ability to tell my customers what they were buying after the fact, it'd be a lot different dynamic than what it would be with a free market where you've got an engaged consumer. That's the other thing we don't talk about. Healthcare consumers have grown. Don't blame it on them. It's evolved that way to where they want no skin in the game. It's unaffordable in so many cases. Once you do confront the healthcare system, it's a mess across the board. And my question is going to be here in a moment for Dr. Kesselheim, but I've wrestled with it before I got to the Senate. And there is no other sector of our economy that has less transparency, less competition, more barriers to entry, and a disengaged consumer. One alternative is to bring government into play. And to be honest, I think many CEOs that don't run healthcare companies are going to be for that because the industry is dug in, resisting reform that I think needs to take place before you bring more government into play. But it's clear we've got a broken healthcare system that costs way too much, and we need to figure out how to fix it. And if the industry is not going to take on some of the reforms, you'll get what you deserve, and that's probably the heavy hand of government because you're like an unregulated utility when it comes to the way you operate. Dr. Kesselheim, I'm hoping that I've got the right information here, but when it comes to transparency, I think you've been quoted in that you might get more than what you've asked for. That transparency would actually maybe be a negative. I think that is so bizarre in the sense that any other aspect of our economy where you have everything I talked about, engaged consumer, robust competition, full transparency, no barriers to entry, things work. LASIK surgery and things even within the medical field prove that. Why would you have that point of view that it could stymie price competition if you put more transparency into the mix? That seems to me to be counterintuitive. I'd love to hear your response to that.
Sure, Senator. So if all you do is include transparency but don't do anything else, then you actually risk raising prices, because right now those secret backroom deals that PBMs arrange is really the only system that we have in the government or in our country for lowering prices. And if you take that away and you make everything fully transparent without doing anything else, then you take away one of the greatest tools that are the only effective negotiators we currently have in the system, which are PBMs and insurance companies, from trying to lower prices. So I would be very much in favor of transparency if you marry it with evaluation and negotiation, because then you don't really need PBMs. You can just have what a fair price is, and you can offer that to private companies. And the value of the PBM and the value of the secrecy that they operate in plummets. So I would say that we could have transparency if we married it with some of the proposals that I suggested. But just transparency alone, I think that you are taking away the only strategy that we currently have in the market for lowering prices.
I'm glad to hear you say that, because I agree with you. I think that when you have transparency only, you don't have the other tools that go along with it. And that would be that employers across the country, as well as government, the two stakeholders in paying the bills, need to be able to negotiate with more bargaining power. And I think if we get that right, it happens everywhere else where government is able to negotiate. They hide behind the disguise that they're a free market. They are not a free market until they do the things I said earlier. So I think what you're talking about, including employers getting in the mix, that's how we bring drug prices down, and then maybe prices cascading down across the system of pharma, hospitals, insurance, and even practitioners. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Braun. Senator Murphy.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thanks, everyone, for this hearing. This is a question to either Dr. Prasad or Dr. Kesselheim. A 2019 study in the Journal of American Medicine Association looked at 15 years of medical marketing in the U.S. and found that there was a 70% increase in healthcare marketing from 1997 to 2016, including a massive increase in direct-to-consumer advertising and promotion to physicians. Clearly, this enormous surge in marketing and advertising provides a benefit to the companies. They wouldn't do it unless it led to the sale of more product. Clearly, it has to be part of the story with respect to the increase in price if there's been this incredible surge in marketing and advertising spending. But my question is it a benefit to the healthcare system as physicians, as folks, through your conversations with colleagues, does direct-to-consumer advertising provide the kind of benefit to patients that the companies would have us believe, or is it just a benefit to their bottom line and a contributor to the increase in cost?
Thank you, Senator. The answer is no, it does not benefit the public, doesn't benefit patients. There have been studies of whether or not marketing is associated with better prescribing of medicines or more appropriate use of medicines. And there are no studies that indicate that this marketing improves the care that patients receive. So it is something that patients are paying for, and we are all paying for. And in the end, it is driving, in some cases, prescribing towards more expensive medicine. So we pay for it multiple times, and there isn't a demonstrated benefit of pharmaceutical companies providing information either directly to consumers or to prescribers.
Dr. Kesselheim?
Sorry, I agree with Dr. Prasad. I think that there is I think that one of the things that direct-to-consumer advertising does, and I can tell you that as a primary care doctor, is it brings people to the office asking about medicines that they saw on TV, and usually the medicines that are being advertised are the most expensive, and they may not offer improvements over other therapies that aren't being advertised. And so, while direct consumer advertising can alert people to the existence of drugs, it does drive prescribing practices in ways that aren't evidence driven.
And just to give a sense of how much of the cost of the drugs may be determinative of the advertising spend for these companies, there's another study suggesting that for the big pharmaceutical companies, as much as 19 cents of every dollar, nearly 1/5 of all of their spending, goes into advertising and marketing. In my remaining time, Dr. Kesselheim, I was intrigued by the time that you spent in your written testimony on the question of comparative effectiveness. And I wondered if you might sort of give us some suggestions as to how the United States can do a better job of making sure that we are getting a true bang for our buck. Other countries spend a lot more time making sure that they are only paying for drugs that are substantially better than other products that are on the market. This issue is fraught with peril because for many folks, a 5% increase in effectiveness or the promise of a potential 20% increase in effectiveness, they're going to want that. They're not going to want the government deciding whether or not they get access to these drugs. But it's an enormous amount of money that we all pay for when some drugs are only getting tiny incremental increases in quality or effectiveness. What's your recommendation for how we proceed on this topic?
Well, Senator, I think this is an extremely important issue. And unfortunately, in the U.S. system, we do not invest nearly enough in doing the type of comparative effectiveness studies that we need in order to determine which drugs are better for which patients. And really, this is the best way to empower patients to make decisions about their care, is to say, look, we've done the studies and we know that this drug works X amount better. Here are the side effects you have to weigh, and let's between you and your physician, you can make a decision about the best way forward. So unfortunately, we don't have enough of that. And what I would suggest that we do is invest more money up front in the same way that we invest money in basic science in generating this information, because it will actually save money on the back end, because pharmaceutical companies leverage the lack of information in their promotional practices to encourage high cost drugs when lower cost products may be just as effective. And then what we do is we just pay many times more on the back end. So if we had more comparative effectiveness research and evidence up front, then we would be able to help guide prescribing practices in the best way forward for patients.
So it doesn't necessarily have to lead to drugs being on or off a formulary, just that information available to prescribers may end up in better care, better practices. Appreciate the answers from both of you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator Murphy. I believe that ends our hearing. We've heard from many, many senators, and I want to thank Dr. Kesselheim, Dr. Brosseau, Elia Spates, and Alex Brill for their participation as well. I think what you have heard from virtually all senators, regardless of their party or political persuasion, is they continue to hear from their constituents who are sick and tired of paying the highest prices in the world for prescription drugs, prices that in many cases they cannot afford. And what you have heard is that when people cannot afford the medicine they need, they will get sicker. Sometimes they will die. Sometimes they will end up in the hospital at great cost to the healthcare system. You have also heard, I think, today, that we have been talking about the issue of the high cost of prescription drugs, not only for years, but for decades, and that there is all kinds of legislation that has been offered. And yet, at the end of the day, the pharmaceutical industry continues to march along, earning huge profits every year, paying their CEOs exorbitant compensation packages, and they continue to provide hundreds and hundreds of lobbyists, make all kinds of campaign contributions. So I think the conclusion that I have reached from this hearing is that the time is long overdue for the United States Congress to summon up the courage to take on perhaps the most powerful special interests in the United States, and that is the power of the pharmaceutical industry. Our people are hurting, they want us to act, and now is the time to do that. So with that, let me conclude this hearing and thank again everybody for participating. The hearing is ended, and people will have time to submit questions for the record and testimony as well. Thank you.